his introduction. Geoff.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person in these times, but we'll do our best with the alternative technology. Rob is actually going to control the slides for me as he puts it in Chris Whitty type style. So perhaps we could start with the first slide, please. Okay, fine. Right. We nearly got there.
Sorry, bear with me a second. I'm not sure what's. I'm having an absolute tech nightmare this morning. I'm just going to try a different option and I will share the screen again in just a moment. Sorry, everyone.
Is it all, Rob? These things happen. While we're waiting for that, if anybody wants to contribute in another way, please use the comment function at the bottom of your screens, and you can share your ideas and comments and thoughts there. We'll see and try our best to pick up on those comments. Or if you want to ask a question, please use the hand function at the bottom as well. Diolch.
That looks good from this end. Okay. Okay. I trust everyone can see that. Perhaps we could go straight on to the second slide, please. Right, good. Okay, that looks very good. I've been asked to talk about different measures of affordability, which at first sight might not actually seem to be the most exciting subject in the world. But the definition of affordability actually matters for appropriate housing policies. If you get the definition wrong, you can actually come up with seriously misleading policies. So essentially, I'm going to look at various different measures this morning, very, very briefly. Now, all the measures which I'm going to talk about have both advantages and disadvantages. I'll try to give you an overview of these. But I think, hopefully you'll see, I think we can do rather better than what is the standard approach both in England and I believe in Wales as well. Broadly, there are 5 possibilities I'm going to look at. 3 of those are in fairly common usage, and the last 2 are ones which I've developed myself, so therefore are slightly less well known. And the 5 different methods are actually on that slide, so I won't read those out. I'll just go on straight onto the first of these definitions, please. Okay. So the first one, commonly known as price to earnings ratios, and this is by far the most commonly used in this country, and I believe it's recommended in Wales as well. The ratio is usually defined in terms of medians these days, median income and median house prices, but sometimes it's also defined in terms of lower quartiles as well. One advantage is that the data are regularly published by the Office for National Statistics, and they're provided down to local authority level. So to give you an idea about the numbers involved, in Wales, back in 2002, that ratio was a value of 3.67. But it had gone up to 5.84 by 2020. And all areas of England have experienced similar increases to this. So the ratio has more than doubled. So affordability, according to this, has massively worsened, or so runs the story. Well, no, unfortunately, you can't actually come to that conclusion because there are a number of different points which you have to take into account. And I'll mention just some of these, some of the key ones. Firstly, only about 2/3 of households actually are owners. So is this really the best measure we can actually come up for renters? Perhaps crucially, the measure can't be used for comparisons over time. This is because changes in interest rates and other factors are capitalized into house prices, so that given the very low level of interest rates that we've experienced for so long, we expect the price to earnings ratio to rise because households can actually afford more housing at low interest rates. But households are not necessarily any worse off from that. Therefore, we can't look necessarily at changes in that ratio over the time without considerable circumspection. Third problem is that the ratio is also not a very good guide to affordability differences in different locations. I'll come back to this a little bit later in the presentation, but remember that in England, this price to earnings ratio is actually used as part of housing local needs assessments. It's usually in official measures. Therefore, it actually has important consequences for what housing requirements are in different parts of the country. Another problem, which is sometimes about it, is that the ratio is sometimes used as a basis for prediction. So, for example, some years ago, I remember the IMF using this as a key indicator internationally. And the idea here is that there is some long-run value to which markets return. So if the price to incomes ratio is above this long-run equilibrium, then prices are going to fall and vice versa. Unfortunately, that's not true, because the ratio itself depends upon a number of other factors, including real interest rates and other things. And it has been the case that forecasters have made major errors in the past by relying on some concept of an equilibrium ratio. Next slide, please. The second commonly used measure is housing expenditure as a proportion of people's incomes, which might seem similar, but it's not the same. And the difference is that if we look at housing expenditures rather than house prices as a proportion of income, then we get over some of the problems of the previous definition. And this again is because changes in interest rates are reflected in their expenditure. But there are still problems. First, if you have measures based on percentages or proportions, they don't tell us anything about the levels, the absolute levels of expenditure. So, for example, for those on low incomes, even if the percentage is high, they may be consuming still very low levels of housing. But for those on high incomes, they may spend a high percentage of their incomes on housing by choice. They choose to spend that high proportion. And it still may be the case they have plenty of income left over for spending on other goods, even if they're spending a higher proportion of their income on housing. So the measure, therefore, doesn't easily distinguish between the two groups. And it also doesn't tell us very much about the quality of housing which is being consumed by different groups. Now, one approach which is quite useful and commonly used, I think, is to consider only those people who are in the bottom part of the income distribution. And I know these are the groups who have fewer choices over their housing decisions. And therefore, this is more likely to apply to renters than to homeowners. And there is something called the 30-40 rules, which is sometimes used. This looks at the proportion of households in the bottom two income quintiles, in other words, the bottom 40%, and the proportion of those who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. So that's the 40% refers to income, and the first 30% refers to their expenditure. Now, a further problem with that, however, is that those percentages are largely arbitrary. So different measures of expenditure sometimes use something between 20 and 40% is commonly chosen. But what we'd really like to know is at what values of expenditure or proportions our households are likely to experience housing stress or meet difficulties in meeting their housing payments. And there's been quite a lot of Australian work on this issue and some work in the United Kingdom. When I played around with these things, rather to my surprise, the work suggests that at least for renters, there does appear to be a relationship between paying more than 25% of your income in rent and actually experiencing financial stress. Furthermore, the stress falls significantly for the higher income groups. And there really isn't stress for those in higher income groups. So, even though there are theoretical disadvantages for this measure, empirically it seems to work tolerably well. But there is a caveat. The work I've done on this has been based on one data set for 1 year. I would like to see rather more work done on it when more information actually becomes available on those. The other point to note is that even then, it doesn't necessarily imply that those on lowest incomes will experience the greatest stress, simply because they'll be more likely to be receiving housing benefits. Certainly, if you do think cuts to housing benefits for those on lower incomes, yes, you will increase stress really quite considerably. Nevertheless, despite those caveats, I think there are some benefits from this approach for renters. Not least, I think this is a very important point, because it's looking at the distribution of outcomes across households rather than simply looking at averages, which is basically what price to earnings ratios do, for example. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Oh, I should have said it before. We go on to the next one, please. Now, a third commonly used measure is something known as the residual income approach. Now, I've noticed earlier there are problems associated with approaches based on percentages or proportions. Now, residual income approaches are based on differences between income and expenditure in levels rather than the ratios. So in principle, it gets around this particular problem. So the idea is to define some minimum level of non-housing expenditures. So for example, defined by a poverty scale. This is then deducted from a household's disposable income to give an idea of the affordable level of housing. So if your actual housing cost expenditure is above this level, then there's an affordability problem. That's the idea of those things, which it has really quite some appeal to it, I think, in principle. But there are still problems. One problem is actually how do you actually define the minimum standards for different household types. And it's also extremely demanding in terms of data if you're going to regularly update this. And therefore, what has tended to happen is that you find one-off studies for particular years or particular locations rather than regular surveys or calculations being made for this. Okay, can we next slide, please? Okay. Now, I say those first three I've looked at are the ones which tend to be used most commonly in the literature and for policy purposes. But I'll say a little bit about some alternative, or two alternatives, which I've tended to develop and explained a little bit more detail in my book. Now, the first of these measures, which I'm going to look at, comes from empirical models of the factors that affect house prices. And we know quite a lot about this because there's been lots and lots and lots of studies of the determinants of house prices across the country. And because it tends to be based more on theory and on empirical results, it avoids some of the problems associated with price to earnings ratios. Now, to do this and to show you a little bit more, I need to go back a little bit from what I've mentioned before. So I mentioned that price to earnings ratios have problems not just for comparisons over time, but also for comparisons between areas at a given point in time. This is particularly a problem. This is particularly a problem because, as I mentioned, this ratio is used in local housing needs assessments in England. Now, there is one really extreme example of the nature of the problem, and this is the local authority called Copeland in the northwest of England. And if you look simply at the price to earnings ratio for Copeland, it is by far the most affordable local authority in the country based on price to earnings ratio. But the reason is because it's the location of the Sellafield nuclear reprocessing plant. And the presence of the plant is negatively capitalized into house prices, so that the ratio does not represent a true excess supply of homes in Copeland. And even though that's probably the most extreme example, it is an example of a more general problem. And this is because, in general, prices capitalize positive or negative externalities arising from the physical environment. So I believe Wales is particularly worried about second homes arising from the environment. Well, for example, that's going to be capitalized into the physical environment of nice places in Wales is going to be capitalized into house prices. Therefore, that measure could be biased. To be slightly facetious, basically, instead of, if you really want to use that ratio, by far the easiest way to improve your affordability is to build lots of nuclear power stations in those areas. Other things which will induce negative externalities in those areas. Okay. Right. Okay. So if I'm arguing that we can't use or shouldn't use price to earnings ratios for local comparisons, one suggestion I've come up with, which I have to say is not actually being used at the moment, which I think has advantages, is essentially the ratio of the local population relative to the size of the housing stock, weighted by average earnings. Now, this doesn't suffer from the problems which I've mentioned, and it's based on firmer theoretical foundations. Now, what does it actually mean? Well, because it's unfamiliar, it might look a bit strange. But basically, the ratio of population relative to the housing stock tries to capture demographic influences on housing demand and need, whereas the earnings elements into it captures the economic influences, because we know that earnings are an important determinant of relative house prices across different parts of the country. So I think it's quite a sensible way of looking at it, but the downside is that politically it would bias building towards areas with high earnings, and that's probably not consistent with the levelling up white paper, where building is geared towards the northern industrialised areas. I think there actually are ways around this by attaching different weights to different objectives. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? I've got a question, but perhaps I'll come back to that, to that later. Okay, right. Right. Okay, so a couple of points for you to remember. Well, what I want to look at now are measures which are more appropriate to owner-occupier, particularly first-time buyers, and particularly ones which allow for the distribution of outcomes, which I've already said I think are important. Now, it is possible to derive a measure for potential first-time buyers that looks at the distributions as well as averages. For most existing home buyers, it's not a problem. Once you've actually got beyond the first few years of your mortgage, most owner-occupiers don't actually experience housing stress at the current time. But what we really want to know is what proportion of properties in any area can be afforded by potential first-time buyers with different income levels. Now, there are some technical issues involved with the construction of these measures, which I'm going to ignore today, but they're based on a wider measure of poverty known as the Lorentz curve. Now, to construct these, you need to make assumptions about what deposits these households could put down, the length of the mortgage period, and the mortgage interest rate which you're facing. Now, you might think that that's a disadvantage in some way. Actually, I see it as an advantage, because it means we can actually carry out simulations about how affordability is affected according to variations in interest rates and mortgage terms and all of these sorts of things. And what it does is it ties housing in more precisely to developments in the wider macroeconomy, which I think is actually crucial. Housing is not independent of what's going on in the rest of the economy. Now, whether this can actually be constructed from Wales, to be honest, I'm not sure. The main problem is the calculation of the appropriate income data, which is not straightforward even across England and would need looking at in Wales, I think. But I think there possibly are ways around this to deal with that. But again, it's a slight caveat. Now, can I have the next slide, please, which shows the examples of what I mean. Got two pretty pictures here. These are Lorentz curves. The top one is for the southeast of England, and the bottom one is for the northeast. And essentially, along the horizontal axis, we've got the income distribution. So the left-hand side is the lower part of the income distribution, the right-hand side is the top part of the income distribution. And on the vertical scale, we've got the distribution of house prices in the region. So low prices at the bottom, high prices at the top. Now, essentially, what the straight line, the undotted line, which is the 45-degree line, is what we call a line of equality. So basically, it would tell us that if the distribution of house prices and incomes was such that 10% of the households would be able to afford the bottom 10%, 20% would be able to afford 20% of properties, and so on and so forth. So the dotted line, however, is what we actually experience in practice. So therefore, the gap between those two lines tells us about the degree of inequality in housing conditions across the distribution. And basically, the wider is the gap, essentially the more is unequal, or the more difficult it is for households, to first-time buyers in this case, to afford housing. So to give you an example of what it means in the top one, it means that for potential first-time buyers in the Southeast in 2017-18, you actually had to have an income above the median income to be able to afford any housing to buy in the Southeast of England. It's that extreme. Okay, and you can see it sort of moves up quite sharply. But basically, if you were in the bottom part of the half of the income distribution, you wouldn't have been able to afford to become an owner-occupier, at least on the assumptions which we made. Now, the bottom one for the Northeast, you can see, is much less extreme, but it still exists. There is still a gap. To say that there's no affordability problem in the Northeast is not the case. Okay, just to conclude, because I think my time's getting close to being up, I have the last slide. Right, some conclusions. Now, intuitive simplicity is appealing, and price to earnings ratios do that, but they can be highly misleading. Crucially, housing's about distributions, and simple averages are missing very important features. No single indicator is going to work for all purposes. It depends on what and who you're interested in. Also, although I haven't really spoken about this much, beware of putting too much emphasis on spatial relativities at one moment in time. So I know you're particularly concerned at the moment about movements in house prices in Wales relative to other parts of England. Be a little bit careful about that. One of the things which has occurred across Britain for a long, long time are something known as the so-called ripple effects. And basically that means that different parts of the country has prices changing at different points in time, but they tend to catch up. You get very big short-run differences, but at least some of the short-term, longer-term relatives tend to be restored or corrected over time. That may or may not be the case in Wales, and I haven't done the work to check whether that's cases. So very finally, I suggested a couple of new approaches, which you won't find used commonly. But one problem, and perhaps the biggest problem really, is public acceptance of any measure which you use. It's really very, very hard to change traditional ways of doing things. I've been trying for many, many years with not much success, but we keep trying on these things. Okay, thank you very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Athro Meen. Thank you very much, Professor Meen, for that really, really interesting presentation. A lot of questions arising from it, and I've got a few questions myself, but I'll hold off from asking my questions. We've got a couple of minutes. There is a question on chat, but before we go to that, are there any other questions from those present in the meeting that you'd like to ask Professor Meen on his presentation? Unrhyw gwestiynau gan unrhyw un sydd yn bresennol? Sgwrwch yn Wnewch chi ddefnyddio eich llaw if you can indicate by using the reactions, the little hand on the bottom.
Yeah. How are we actually controlling this? Tell me which questions to answer.
Okay, we'll start. There's no response on the hands section at the moment.
There's one hand up I can see.
Right.
Alan Shepherd.
Yeah, I'm Danny. Go for it.
Diolch. Alan Shepherd from the Wales Co-op Centre. I was just wondering, you were talking about local populations and how that might impact on the figures. But I wondered how you factored in external players, because obviously housing is not just related to the local population, but particularly in Wales with the second home issue, people are coming from beyond the border to buy homes here.
Yeah, it's Yeah, it's, I mean, it's a problem also in obviously some parts of England as well. If you look at Devon, for example, it's a similar sorts of issue. Now, what you tend to find there is for all of these very popular, desirable locations. Another very good example actually is North Norfolk. Essentially what you tend to find is that measures based on price to earnings ratios will give you a higher, will give an indicator which is more unaffordable than measures based on population relative to the housing stock, i.e. the one I'm suggesting. That's because essentially, you know, the population is resident population rather than visitors, really. Now, it's a question of what you want. I would argue, I think that I'd rather base these things on resident populations rather than just visitors, because I think it could be, you know, misleading. And similarly, basing it on earnings, you know, the earnings element of that, the earning element really ought to be resident earnings rather than the incomes of second homes people coming in from the area, because that's really reflecting the local economy. So I would argue essentially that by having lots, you know, the areas which have lots of second homeowners are affected really quite inappropriately by price to earnings ratios. It is an example of one of the problems. Actually, although I shouldn't plug my book, there's a little graph in the book about showing what the relationship between the two measures actually are. I'm sure that can be shared if anyone wants to. And for most places, the measures track quite closely, but it is areas with holiday locations where things vary quite considerably.
Lovely, thank you for that response. And we'll try one more. Craig Abiago.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. Yeah, just the ripple effect. I just want to ask a question about the ripple effect. Would the ripple effect, like for I'm in Gwynedd, so I'm the cabinet member for housing in Gwynedd, would, for example, we have a lot of people moving in from or buying homes from outside of the county. We have a low medium wage. When you say the ripple effect, you just mean the house prices would go up so that they would be the same as they are in the places that people are moving in from. But if our wages don't move up, if our local wages don't move up, it still means our houses are unaffordable. So although the ripple effect might level up houses, it won't necessarily, it still won't solve any problem though, will it? Or possibly exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the ripple effect is not quite that. The ripple effect does traditionally refer to prices rather than prices relative to earnings. And my point was that actually there's a little graph on the first graph which I didn't talk about really, but essentially the ratio of prices in England relative to Wales goes in cycles. So sometimes it goes up, you know, quite sharply, sometimes it goes down or whatever. We may be at a particular point now where it's, you know, rising more, but you can't necessarily assume that it won't go back down in terms of relativities in the future. So simply looking at prices in Wales by themselves at a particular point in time, and I'll stress that last bit, is not necessarily sufficient to draw any conclusions. You need to look at rather longer term trends rather than just 1 or 2 years.
Geoff, thank you very much for your presentation, for your responses. And all of this will be on Shelter's YouTube channel. Matt, I see you have your hand up. Is there a very quick question you want to ask there, Matt?
Yeah. Just moving on from Alan's question. You know, in terms of second homes, yeah, but there's another phenomenon, if I can say it, emerging, which is you know, not people buying second homes, but people actually moving westward from more affluent areas to live because of, you know, the new agile working, etc. You know, and so they're moving into areas like Cardiff, you know, along the North Wales corridor with much higher wages from different areas, but obviously factoring that into the housing market in that ratio. I just wondered whether you had any initial thoughts on that. I mean, it's a bit anecdotal at the moment, obviously, but you know, if large numbers are doing that, then it has a huge impact, doesn't it?
It has an impact, certainly. Yeah, well, obviously moving does happen, and yes, it should be reflected in prices, and that's an ordinary market response. I mean, I'd be surprised. I mean, I don't know the Welsh data well enough to be definitive about it, but it's not going. I'd be surprised if it was the only factor going on in there. It's one of a lot of different factors. One of the things when you get into I think when you're into your wider debates in policy, you're going to have to think quite carefully about the extent to which prices, affordability in Wales are actually divorced from the wider GB economy in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. My guess is probably essentially those are more important than those migration trends. But that's a guess based on what you typically experience in England. I can't definitively say that's the case in Wales.
Once again, thank you very much, Geoff. Anybody interested in Geoff's book, there's a link. Jenny's posted it on the chat from Bristol University Press. Have a look at it. But if you can, Geoff, that's really useful and will help us in our deliberations, certainly, as we go on. Now, we're running out of time slowly, so we'll swiftly move on to Becky Ricketts, NUS Cymru ICMEC President. NUS will have done some work with the shelter on the quality of student housing. And this is the second part of their wider response to that. So Becky, over to you, please.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. So if somebody could let me know that you can see it, that would be really great.
Yes, we can see it, Becky. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There we are, perfect. So thank you so much, everybody. So my name is Becky Ricketts and I am President of NUS Wales. And I'm here with my colleague Joe as well, Joe Atkinson, again from NUS Wales. So for those of you that don't know, fixing student housing has been my priority campaign this year as NUS Wales President. So, all of us on this call will know the importance of having that safe, that warm place to be able to call home. And that is exactly the same for our students here in Wales. We've also done some work on mental health, and we know that mental health and student housing just absolutely go hand in hand. Them affect ability to work, to study, to socialise, to get a job, all of these extra things. So that is why we at NUS Wales this year have partnered with Shelter Cymru to work on student housing, to look at issues, look at what students think, and to come up with some suggestions and some recommendations on how we can fix a system that we believe is fundamentally broken at that foundation. So the reality is that student accommodation is far more of a problem that a lot of us realise. It is the #1 non-academic issue that students' unions give support to students to, bigger than finances, bigger than mental health, bigger than anything else, simply because there is so much that can go wrong with housing and so many external factors that affect a student's home. So throughout the pandemic, like all of us, students spent more time in their houses and their accommodation than any other year previously. Then for them, more time in isolation, away from flatmates, away from friends, away from family, more time in those cold, damp rooms, and more time to realise that actually this is just not okay. So back at the beginning of the pandemic and in the first major lockdown, students were given an order to leave their student accommodation and to return home to their holiday address to ride out the pandemic. Not only did this mean that thousands of students probably spent hundreds or thousands of pounds on rent for rooms that they were ordered not to be in, but for students who didn't even have a second address, it felt to them like they were being evicted from the only place that they were really able to call home. And the recent announcement from Rishi Sunak on the rebate for utility bills won't actually benefit students. The £200 credit loan will be applied to each bill in every household, and this includes students in houses of multiple occupancy, which I'll go on to in a minute. But as those students leave those houses and get houses of their own, they're actually going to be paying that back. That's something that they didn't ever benefit from in the first place. So in terms of cost of living, this is just one extra thing that will be added on top of their rent. So just for some quick context, there are different types of student accommodation that students access while in education. So the first one you see here is university halls, which are owned by institutions and operated by them as well. These generally tend to house first-year students, not exclusively, but primarily first-year students to help them get that bond and get themselves on their feet as they start university. The second one is private purpose-built student accommodation, which we shorten to PBSA. These are the fastest expanding type of student accommodation that we see. Often high-rise blocks, high-rise buildings in major cities. We've got one going up in Cardiff, Newport, Swansea. They're starting to crop up quite a lot in Wales. And these are run purely as a business. They can sometimes be favoured by universities to be seen as accommodation partners, but they're not owned by the institutions. You know, some examples are Unite Students, Student Roost, Collegiate. But due to the amount it costs to rent a place in one of these are often only filled and primarily occupied by international students, which, you know, can kind of contribute to that potential segregation and disparity that we see in student populations. And then the other one which we're going to talk about is houses of multiple occupancy, or HMOs. So these are your multiple bedroom properties with kind of shared facilities, shared kitchens, bathrooms and things like that. Generally occupied by students in their second year or higher. Master's students, PhD students as well can sometimes live in these. And these accommodations can either be managed by a letting agent or let out by private landlords, and are the most common form of property that students live in whilst in education. They're also the housing type with the lowest percentage of refunds during the pandemic. 9% of landlords gave students back rent when students were sent home from university during the first lockdown, which I spoke about previously. So yeah, it's been really difficult for these students to get recourse from this particular type of accommodation. But, you know, what do students say? So the first part of our work with Sherlock Cymru was a report based on a survey of students at education institutions across Wales. The report came out in November and was actually really well covered by BBC Wales at the time. But the findings seemed to really resonate with people who were kind of keen to share their own experiences and their student housing horror stories, we called it on social media, but to kind of share these stories from their student days. And some of these stories were going back 20, 30 years, but still resonate with students today, which is quite a shock to us, actually. So from this survey, some of the problems that we found we expected and some of them we didn't. So the report found that more than half of our students had experienced damp or mold in their housing, 40% experienced some form of disrepair, and 31% had problems with their landlords. I think the bottom one there was kind of the most eye-opening for me. You know, a quarter of students having to live with rodents or pests in their accommodation was just incredible for us to be able to find. But how do these things actually affect our students? Obviously, I talked earlier on about the effect between mental health and, you know, the link between mental health and accommodation, but there's so much more. You know, 65% of students said that it affected their mental health, but also more than a third of students have experienced physical health issues, whether that be kind of, you know, breathing issues, asthma, whatever it might be. And a quarter have actually said that the quality of their accommodation has affected their academic achievements. Again, you know, links quite closely with the mental health aspect. Another thing we looked into was actually students looking to be pressured to sign contracts to secure their housing early for next year, you know, as early as possible in the academic year. You know, students aren't really experienced in this area anyway. To be pressured leads students failing to either properly read a contract, look at their housing adequately, to be able to scope out their landlord or their letting agent, understand their rights. And it's a huge additional pressure that students face. So 40% of our students that we surveyed said that they felt pressure to sign a contract early to make sure that they were guaranteed a house for next year and not be left kind of looking for accommodation after Christmas. Something that I experienced as a student myself, I was kind of pressured to sign my second year contract by November. Bearing in mind, I'd only just started in September. So yeah, it's very much happening up and down the country. So we asked a question on where students kind of look to get support, and kind of the results in front of you there demonstrate that part of the issue is that students just don't know where to go when they're experiencing a housing issue. Family and friends is the highest one at 54%, is the number one reason for support. It might be due to that idea of shared experiences or not being judged if they go to somebody looking for advice. Only a third of our students will actually go to their student unions or their education provider for help. And even fewer will go to professional advice services like Shelter or Citizens Advice. So there's definitely some work that can be done around how we actually utilise these services to properly support our students. The next few slides are just some quotes that we had from our survey, which really stood out to us. So I had to do an exam, rustling about in the cupboards. You wouldn't expect a student to have to sit there for 3 hours with a rat trying to do an exam. It's no wonder it affects their academic achievements. Communicating with letting agents is horrendous. They rarely sort things out. Again, because students are quite temporary, they're only kind of in accommodation for maybe 10 months maximum. It's kind of, we don't really have to sort this out. It will die down on its own. Students are expected to live in awful conditions just because it's the student way of living. And I think this is something that is shared by an awful lot of students. This idea or this myth of rite of passage, but all students live in mouldy, rubbish accommodation. So it's fine, it's part of the student experience. It makes you tough, it makes you strong. But why do we have this myth? Why is this something that we just kind of accept? Are we okay with students coming out of education in Wales with that view of accommodation that it just should be a bit rubbish because it's just how it is? It's not really the message that we want to be sending to students that, living in crap accommodation makes you tough. It's not what we want. Students deserve much better than that. So this first report made some high-level recommendations and principles that we believe the sector should implement to make sure students are prioritised in their housing. They're not asking for the world, far from it, really. In a society that apparently values students and young people, that the 3 hours on the screen are really basic. All students have the same rights and protections, must be able to hold their landlords to account, and must be able to afford to live in safe, healthy housing. So the annual survey that we do in conjunction with Unipol just kind of adds to those stark stats that we've kind of seen. Student rent has increased, but has the quality increased to match that rise? I don't really think at the moment we're seeing evidence of that. So the survey that we did with Unipol found a 29% rise in the average annual cost of student accommodation in 3 years, which is far above the rise in housing prices. This is part of a 61% rise in student rent over the past 10 years and a 4.4% rise in the last year alone, despite the impact on the pandemic on people's finances, the ability to find jobs, etc. So it's a really bleak picture at the moment. And obviously, I know Professor Jeffrey talked about that possibility of rent taking up more of people's income. I'm seeing exactly the same with students as well. Rent has gone from taking up 53% of the student package in 2018-19 to 59% this academic year. So 59% of a student's loan is going just on rent alone. And from students coming from other parts of the UK wanting to study in Wales, the situation is actually even worse. For Scottish students who want to study in Wales, 116% of their loan is gone on rent. And students from Northern Ireland who want to study in Wales, 125% of their loan is gone on rent. So instantly, there's a real difficulty for those students that maybe do want to study in Wales, but physically cannot afford it. When 125% of their loan is going on rent, where does food come in? Where does bills come in? Where does socialising come in? Where does travel come in? It's a really, really bleak picture. So the final report that I want to talk through is the one that we published together with Shelter Cymru just last week, actually. So this was the second part of our work with them, and it looked at kind of more regulatory and legislative frameworks surrounding student accommodation. I think when we went into it, we knew it would be quite a complex situation, but I don't think either us or Shelter Cymru actually realised just how difficult it would be to navigate this landscape. You know, and for students who want to pursue any redress options, it's incredibly difficult. You know, in the report that the system is overly complicated and bureaucratic and is difficult to grasp for experienced housing experts, never mind young people living away from home for the first time. So the second part of the report found that the sheer volume and complexity of housing law in Wales makes it difficult for students to navigate their rights and actually take action when they want to. The regulatory framework is very much laid by the 2004 Housing Act, but various pieces of primary and secondary legislation, as more powers have become devolved over the years, has led to a real patchwork system, and it's just not really clear where the different forms of student housing actually sit within the current system. So really, the overall effect is that the students' options for redress and recourse are quite often just ineffective, quite limited, causes a lot of confusion, doesn't really empower students to stand up for themselves. So essentially, the routes which students follow depend on the accommodation they live in. The system for those living in university halls is different from those in purpose-built student accommodation, although, you know, sometimes they might argue that they're actually quite similar. There has also not been any regulation update for over 15 years in Wales, so no, it's outdated when it's not recognising the different types of accommodation and the different places that students now decide to live. Trying to navigate this system in 2022, it is quite still outdated. So students who live in university halls style accommodation can pursue redress through these various codes of practice that currently exist. But students who live in the private rented sector, despite HMOs being the majority accommodation choice for our students, have to go through the courts if they can't settle a dispute with their landlord by themselves. And, you know, for those students, the reality is that they just don't really have the time, the experience, or the money to actually go through the courts to seek justice. So usually they just choose not to. It's just not possible for them to. So, you know, landlords kind of get away with poor conditions, and the cycle just begins again for the next set of tenants. So the implementation of the Renting Homes Act was announced actually as the second part of the report was being written. So I think for us, this is a real move in the right direction. You know, there are opportunities within this to improve students' awareness of their rights, things like fitness for human habitation, or strengthen students' hands. But as it is so often the case, you know, the success of the Act will depend on just ensuring that the relevant authorities have the resources that they need to actually ensure effective enforcement of this is possible. So the first report that we did with Shelter made some kind of those three basic high-level recommendations. But the second part of this actually makes more practical kind of short-term recommendations that we think would actually, you know, immediately benefit students. The recommendations consider what sector bodies can do to make the redress and recourse system better for students, ensure that more students are actually aware of their rights in the first place. So for local authorities, we think that there's a job to be done to ensure that students are aware of their rights, especially if the Renting Home Act has been implemented. You know, too many students are still really unaware of how to challenge housing disputes, and this is always going to be a difficult area. We know this. But, you know, we need to continue to consider how we can reach those students and young people, as you know, they are probably incredibly vulnerable to landlords that quite simply want to exploit them. For us, we have a job to do here as well. And there is a role for us to bring together sector stakeholders to consider kind of how we can take the recommendations we in Shelter have made and actually implement them. So hopefully this meeting that we're all in now will represent the first step in us doing that. You know, as is our work in partnership with Shelter from the last year. We work closely with our student unions and with students every day, and you know, we recognise there is a big role for us in helping them reach the students on the ground. Shelter Cymru, we are obviously, you know, Shelter Cymru are going to work to provide training to student unions advisors on housing issues and implementing the things that we've discovered within our reports. They're also working on advice and support that they provide to students to ensure that more students can actually make use of the valuable support that's out there. There's so much support out there, it's just making sure that students know it's there and they know it's relevant to them. Welsh Government, obviously you have a big role to play in, setting the mood and taking the lead on making this an absolute priority. I think one of the first things the government to do is to review the 2006 student accommodation order, give the significant changes of the sector over the past 50 plus years. Rent repayment orders are also a valuable tool for tenants in other parts of the UK, and we believe that they could give students significant redress opportunities if implemented here in Wales. So that is the end of the presentation. Diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you so much. I will stop sharing my screen and we're done. Thank you so much. Diolch.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Becky. Thank you very much. There's a lot of things to take out from there. On this call this morning, we've got, obviously, we've got members of the Senedd. There are also representatives of local government here and food sector organisation. So a lot of things there for all of us to think away and work on. So thank you for that, Becky. And there's some synergy there, certainly between what Geoff said at the first presentation around the definition of affordability and how we define that, but then some real tangible evidence there with Becky of how students are struggling to find accommodation affordable for them. I know Jenny raised a point in the chat function that we need a Welsh housing survey because of that lack of definition of affordability. So all Senedd members here today, if you are happy to work with myself and for us to work together, let's try and ensure we get that done and work with Shelter on that. I'm afraid we are running out of time for questions for yourself, Becky, because it's been such a good and full report. But Becky did share her contact details at the end there. Becky, if you could just share your contact details in the chat as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Anybody, please contact Becky. You'll be able to get that report directly as well and work with NS Cymru. So briefly, we will be holding programs, breakfast briefing programs to unpick some of the issues that have been raised this morning. You will be getting invites and details in due course. Please join those breakfast briefings so that we can look at the presentations and try and understand them in greater detail so that we can formulate some sort of responses and challenges to the government, and we can start the process of developing a Welsh housing survey and a definition of affordability. Thank you very much once again to all of you who've been in attendance. Really do appreciate it and looking forward to seeing you at the next meeting soon. And finally, just before I forget, thank you specifically to Rob Simpkins of Shelter. Rob is finishing with Shelter before long. He's been a stalwart and a great help to all of us on a personal level. Thank you, Rob. And I'm sure that everybody who's worked with Rob over the last few years will want to thank him as well for his work. So thank you, Rob, very much. And there we go. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.
Diolch. Bye now.
Diolch yn fawr.
Rob, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That was, yeah, enjoyed that.
Really good, and really appreciate the work that you've done, mate.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. What we'll do is we'll get the recording of this sorted. I'll go through it, type out some notes because I was busy spinning tech plate, and yeah, once I've done that, we'll get it across to you for approval. But no, I think that went well. Good sharing. Thank you. That was very timely.
I did nothing.
That's not true.
I appreciate it, and listen, I'll be in touch with you soon for the breakfast briefings and everything, but your mind is going to be elsewhere now.
Oh no, not at all. No, I'm still 100% shot the company right the way through to the end till we finish. But no, that's great. Yeah, obviously, anything you need, give me a shout. But we'll get the recording sorted out for this and all the notes and stuff in the meantime. And obviously, anything ahead of Wednesday, we'll send you the updated notes very soon.
Great. You're a good man. Thanks, Rob.
Real, diolch, Mabon. I'll speak to you soon.
Cheers, man.